for our neighbors to maintain safe, sustainable, and dignified homes. Our class today is Intro to Composting, sponsored by Kalamazoo Community Foundation, so thank you to them. Our wonderful instructor is Mandy Dixon, Master Gardener from the MSU Extension. She's been with us through this whole Handy at Home Green series. So we're kind of building off of our last workshop, which was Intro to Container Gardening. But grab your snacks. The bathroom is up the ramp and to the right. And enjoy. I'll hand it over to you, Mandy. Thank you.
Good evening. Today we're going to talk about compost. We talked about gardens, introduction to gardens. We've talked about container gardening. And now this is kind of the base. This is your start of all of your gardens. This is the thing you need for every garden. Every single gardening class we've talked about has talked about compost. So we're going to talk about how to make your own. So compost is decomposed organic matter like leaves, vegetable scraps. Once it's broken down, it turns into humus. It doesn't break down any further. Plants can use it and improves your soil quality. It takes place through microscopic organisms like fungi, bacteria, and also your earthworms, your bugs. They all contribute to your compost. A lot of gardeners do call it black gold because it's so valuable in the process. This little thing was a ad that was actually up in a school. 68% of waste thrown away on a college campus can be recycled or composted. So instead of filling your landfills, you can compost a lot of your materials and it will help your environment, help your gardens. So why do we compost? One, for recycling, like we just mentioned. It improves your soil nutrients, reduces the need for chemical fertilizers, benefits the soil health, it's convenient, and it's free. You don't really need any special materials to compost. Compost gives you the nutrients that you need to replace each year in the garden. So that's why every spring we encourage you to add a layer of compost to your garden beds. It puts back in what the plants have taken out during the season because you're composting a lot of different materials and just putting those nutrients right back into the soil. So we're going to talk a little bit about healthy soil. One of the things we talked about with your gardening and your container gardening is making sure you know what kind of soil, and that if you have clay soil, it holds too much water and it doesn't drain well enough, and you have sandy soil, it loses water a lot faster. Well, what compost can do is it helps you improve your soil health and your soil composition. So clay soils, they've got very tiny pore spaces. They don't drain very well. So the slow drain can leave your soil saturated. So you have a harder time growing because your plants are getting waterlogged. And you really need that oxygen in the soil in order to prevent that. Soil with poor drainage can lead to damage or death of the plant. So sandy soils, on the other hand, have too large of a pore space between particles, which reduce this ability to hold that water. Organic matter, when added to sandy soil, helps it hold moisture, makes nutrients available for use, and it acts as a glue to hold them together. Now, one of the things I didn't mention in the clay soils here, but I meant to, is that this actually breaks up your clay soil, so it increases the pore spaces and helps it release some of that water so you don't have as much of a water log. So your compost will help both clay and sandy soils become better for the plants. So we've got a little video here that we're going to watch, and it's really just a real basic couple of minute introduction to composting, and then we'll talk through the steps in more detail. But this is just a real nice introduction, a nice easy way of looking at how composting is easy for the home gardener.
One of the biggest reasons most people don't compost or quit too soon is because they think it's too complicated. But I'm here to tell you, making compost at home couldn't be easier because it only comes down to 3 simple steps. So in this video, I'll walk you through those 3 important steps and get you composting with confidence in no time. While the recipe for making compost at home might seem surprisingly simple, it's the essence of classic composting that even the professionals use. There are just 4 ingredients you need to make compost: air, water, carbon, known as browns, and nitrogen, known as greens. Browns include leaves, twigs, paper, and cardboard. Greens include grass clippings, vegetable scraps, garden trimmings, and coffee grounds. And I know what you're thinking, coffee grounds are brown in color. True, but they're still considered green because they're high in nitrogen, so don't let the physical color throw you. Build your compost heap or pile in a convenient place that has access to water. Continue to add whatever greens or browns you can get your hands on until the pile is approximately 4 feet tall and wide. That's considered an ideal size for home composting to work efficiently. Just never add meat, dairy, or grease. As the pile is building and beyond the time that it reaches ideal size, mix it often. Once a week is good, and while you're mixing it, add water to keep it moist, about like a damp sponge. Once the pile reaches the ideal size of 4 by 4, start a new pile and repeat the process. For the original pile, don't add any new ingredients to it. That's what the new pile is for. But keep turning the original pile while adding moisture about once a week. In approximately 3 months, if you keep with it, the greens and browns will biodegrade to finished compost. You'll know when it's ready when the ingredients are unrecognizable, the internal temperature is ambient, and the contents smell rich and earthy. That is finished compost. And when your compost is ready to use, you can top dress it to an existing bed around your plants about 1 inch thick, or if it's a new bed, you can add it to that soil about 4 inches deep and just mix it all together. Fortunately, a little bit goes a long way. But this recipe for success will not only get you started, but keep you going strong for years to come. And we have a lot more information about composting on our YouTube channel at Joe Gardner TV and on our website at joegardner.com. So come on over and have a look around, and we'll see you again soon.
Post. The waxy papers, you can shred your old junk mail. Just make sure it's doesn't have that waxy surface on it. Greens include things like grass clippings, vegetable waste, fruit scraps, coffee grounds. And yeah, coffee grounds are brown in color, like he mentioned, but they are a nitrogen-heavy source, so it counts in the greens. And you're going to want to have both in your compost pile. If you have too much browns, it's not going to compost. It won't break down well. But if you have too much greens, it's going to start smelling pretty quickly. Don't compost meat, bones, fish scraps, because they're going to attract your raccoons and all of your other fun critters. Don't compost perennial weeds, because they're just going to start growing in your compost pile. And if you have diseased plants, the compost that you make at home is not hot enough to break down the diseases that are in those plants. So make sure you are not including those in your pile, or you're just going to bring that right back into your garden. Do not allow compost to dry out. Your pile can't dry out, or you will stop breaking down. The compost should be moist but not soaked. One of the keys that we suggest you do is make sure it's the equivalent of a wrung out sponge. So it should be a damp but not wet. So if you take that sponge, you wring it out, it's about that damp. This is what your compost pile should be for optimal breakdown. Don't forget to turn your compost pile. What it does is it allows the oxygen to get into that pile, which helps with the decomposition process. The bacteria breaks down the browns and greens, and if you don't have enough moisture, you don't have enough oxygen, the bacteria won't be able to do its job. So here's a list of things that can be composted and things that should not be composted. Cardboard, uncoated, small pieces. Pretty much anything you put in a compost pile should be shredded or broken down into small enough pieces that it's not a big sheet. One, it'll help you with the turning of it so it won't turn in big clumps. And two, it'll help break down faster because in our home piles, we're not going to get up to high temperatures really. But you can compost eggshells, break them down, break them up, throw them in a blender, chop them up, whatever you need to do. Grass clippings, fruits, veggies, fireplace ashes from natural wood only, not no plywood or treated wood that you've burned. But if you have just regular logs that you burn, you can use that. Hair and fur actually can be in there. Straw, hay, houseplants, leaves, shredded newspaper, nutshells, paper, anything uncoated, like we said, no wax surfaces, sawdust, tea bags, wood chips, yard trimmings. We did talk about coffee grounds. You can just throw the whole filter and everything in your compost pile. But you don't want to do things like black walnut leaves or twigs because they do have those chemical compounds in the leaves that inhibit growth, and you're just going to spread them all over your garden. Coal or charcoal ash might contain substances harmful to plants, so you just want to be cautious, but I can imagine most of us have that unless you're using a charcoal grill. Dairy products and actual eggs. The eggshells are fine, but not the actual eggs themselves. No disease or insect-ridden plants or anything. We've talked about that. We don't want to put it back in the garden. Pretty much anything you're putting in here, you're eventually putting back in your garden. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. No meat, fish bones, scraps, fat, grease, lard. The fat, grease, lard is because of the smell and the attracting of rodents and pets. And no pet feces or cat litter. Those are, again, going to attract pests, and you don't really want that in your food if you're putting this back in your garden. Yard trimmings treated with chemical pesticides. If you have a lawn service that comes in and sprays chemicals all over your yard, you're not going to want to put the grass clippings from that in your compost pile. So there's a lot of different methods of composting. So we're going to talk about several different varieties. These all are varying in difficulty, how easy, how much space they take. The one we talked about on that video a little bit is doing these 4x4 piles. So literally all you're going to do is pile up your yard and kitchen vegetable materials. You're going to throw your shredded papers in there. You can throw your dry this season all in your compost pile, mix it up occasionally. Again, moist sponge-like consistency, so if you have to spray it with a hose, go ahead. It's usable the following season. So if you started doing that at the beginning of this year, let it run over the year. By next spring, you can use that compost pile. So normally what people do is have at least 2 or 3 of these piles next to each other. Start with one. Once you've decided that's full enough, you've got your 4x4 and it's as tall as you want it. Move to the next one and keep turning the first one. And that'll keep the process moving. And by next spring, that first one will be ready to go. Pros, it's easy. This is super easy to do. Cons, it does take time and it does take some space. You're going to need at least 2 of those piles. It's going to take a little bit of room, and it again takes a full season pretty much to get your compost. Hot composting produces compost within 6 to 8 weeks. But this is going to take you a little more patience, a little more time, a little more math almost. Ratio of mixing browns to greens is 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. So you have to have 2 to 3 times as much of the brown materials, which are your papers, your dried leaves, twigs, things like that, twice as much of that as you have of your greens. And most households have more greens than brown. You'd have to intentionally make a focus on getting your 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 ratio. You do have to mix the pile every single week, so not just the occasional turning. You want to do this habit every week. Check the moisture level of the pile every week and keep that wet sponge consistency. But this is faster, 6 to 8 weeks, and you've got your first pile done, ready to go back in the garden. It does take space. You definitely have to have multiple bins for this.
Okay, so I assume composting, having a compost pile is a little different, out of sight, out of mind, mentality. So, like, where on your property would you recommend putting a compost pile? Is it okay for it to be like kind of out of sight, out of
Absolutely.
mind?
Most people put them in some sort of enclosure just so that it's out of sight. You don't really want to see a pile of trash. I mean, literally, it's a type of trash, and people don't want to see that. If you're doing a good mix of browns and greens, it's not going to really smell for you. But most people put it in some sort of enclosure. I've seen pallets. I've actually had a pallet one before where you just put up 3 pallets on the sides, and in the middle is your bin. So at least on 3 sides, it's hidden from view. And then one side is easy to access, easy to turn, easy to add water to it. So as long as you have access to get water to it when it dries out, especially the hotter it gets, the more likely it is to dry out. Or if we've not had rain in a while, so you'll just want to make sure it's able to get water in some form to wherever you're putting it. I wouldn't put it next to your house because there will still potentially be some critters that are interested, even if you keep the meats and the eggs and the proteins out of it, there's still going to be some critters interested. So make sure it's not too close to your house, and out of sight is fine as long as it's not out of mind. So another option, we've talked about cold composting, we've talked about hot composting. Now we're going to talk about vermicomposting, and that is composting using worms. Typically, you need red worms. Red worms are usually known as your night crawlers, bait shop. It's not your everyday garden earthworms. You need Rubbermaid bins, food scraps, newspaper, and red worms. Now, they show you using one bin and then moving it into a second bin. It's kind of like your cold composting or your hot composting process, except you're using worms. You do have to make sure your bins have some form of ventilation, but these are worms. If you have too big a ventilation, they're just going to escape because, people they're very clever. They know how to get out. You also have to be aware that drainage is also an issue. Drainage is really required. If you don't, you're going to have to take these and clean this out much more often because they do tend to accumulate liquids. So this is just an easy way, but there's a lot more involved in that. So there are actual worm bins where you start in the bottom and then you have another layer on top. There's a drain spout at the very bottom, but you start putting your scraps in the next layer up, and the worms will move up into the next layer. So then you can use your bottom layer. And there's bins that will actually do that for you, which is a little bit easier than doing your own. But worms are sneaky and they do escape if you're not careful. We had the person who taught me a little bit about worm composting initially said he forgot to put a lid on it. He put it in the basement, forgot the lid. And of course, these are night crawlers. Typically, red worms are at night. So as soon as the lights go out, they came out and they were all over the basement, and his wife about disowned him. So red worms are required. Worms will eat almost anything. They'll eat fruit, vegetable scraps, bread, grain, tea bags, coffee grounds, filters. They'll eat clothing. If you have an old t-shirt, you shred up and put it in there, they'll eat that. They can't decompose meat, bones, fat, dairy, the stuff you're not going to put in your compost pile anyway. You don't want to put them in this kind of a bin either. There is a video here. I've included some details on the handouts that we have in class today for more information on worm composting. But there is a video. This is vermicomposting Smart Winter Compost Option. It's on the MSU Extension website. And this can be done indoors year-round. I'm not going to actually pull up this right now, but you can access it on the MSU Smart website. There's a lot of other types of composting. There's some that are super easy and some that are a little more complicated and some that are just a little more technical. There's buried composting. This is super easy. So all you do for buried composting is you go out in your yard or whatever your space is, dig a hole. Throw all your compost in this hole, cover it back up, and it'll compost itself. It breaks down in the ground. Again, don't put your meats, your bones, or whatever, but if you can put the same stuff in there, the thing is you're not going to be able to then take that out and put it in your garden, but you're still composting. You're still breaking it down. It's still going back into the soil. So you could theoretically do that in your garden. If you had a bed that you're not using this year, you can do that, cover it up. Next year, it'll be broken down and you can use that bed and you'll have your compost and just rake it through. So that is an option. It's not very practical in order to actually use it in your garden, though, as a top dressing, but it is super easy. So anyone can do that as a form of recycling. There's another thing called hugelkultur. And what hugelkultur is, it's a permaculture style that they actually use. And what you do is you start a pile. But on the pile, what you're doing is you're actually growing on this pile. So this is your bed. This is now your raised bed. This is a type of raised bed. The very bottom, you put your new logs and hardwoods. You're putting really big pieces of wood that are in great condition. Your next layer up is your softwoods and your older wood and some of the stuff that's a little more broken down. And then the next layer is your rotten wood. Then on top of that, you're throwing brush and twigs. So as you notice, we're getting easier stuff to break down. The next level is leaves and grasses. So now you're in the normal stuff compost pile. And then you put your compost soil right on top of that, and you kind of make it in a big heap. Most of them are little, trench like that they start in, and it becomes a pile. And then you can grow right on top of that. Now, mind you, this is going to start sinking as it starts decomposing, but everything that's underneath is decomposing into compost. And your plants on top can use that immediately. You've covered it with compost and soil, so anything you put on top of it can start using that right away. And actually, in my raised beds, I put wood and logs in the very bottom to fill up the space. So a form of this, because every year I have to add top dressing with compost anyway, so the bottom is breaking down. It filled up extra space, so I didn't have to purchase as much garden soil, but it's actually just breaking down into more compost in the bottom of my beds. So it's not really hugelkultur in that case, but it's the same concept. Is you're taking your harder, older woods and putting them on the bottom, smaller stuff on top, and then your compost or garden soil on top of that, and growing in that. And as it breaks down, it's forming compost and soil right at the bottom of your bed. And then I didn't mention it yet, but tumblers. We've all seen those in the hardware stores or online. And they've got those tumblers where you can just throw your stuff in there and then use a little crank and tumble it, or sometimes it doesn't even have a crank and you just turn it. And that's another form. It's a lot faster. It's probably hitting that 6 to 8 week, if not less. So compost, what are you going to use it for? We talked about gardens. We talked about soil. Mix it into the garden soil. It feeds your plants, helps maintain moisture, helps improve your soil quality. Placed on top of the soil, you can use it as a mulch. So this is another form of mulching. So now the next section here, we're going to talk about just some resources. There's a couple different pages. There were, I believe, 3 handouts this time. And this first one is general composting at MSU Extension. It just talks about soils, composting. Next one is from eartheasy.com. It's how to grow compost. This next one is a free master composting course that's offered by MSU. It's online, so you can do it at your leisure, but it will teach you everything you want to know about composting, and it's free. There is an option. There used to be a local option, but now I was unable to find that anymore. Portage used to actually offer free chips, but I can't find that anymore. But getchipdrop.com, you can sign up, and if they happen, an arborist, when they go out to clean up someone's storm damaged trees, if they're in your area, they'll dump a load of chips for free. You kind of have to be in their area. It's a little bit a matter of luck, but it is a free option. Mulch and wood chips are going to be your best friend. Even if you aren't composting, it's going to be helpful to anytime you garden. Some vermicomposting resources that you'll want. Here's some worm and worm composting books. It's called Worms Eat My Garbage. It's like the #1 worm composting book out there. So if you have a chance, I bet the library has it. I don't know your local libraries, but most of them do. There's also a little podcast. It's offthegridnews.com. It's a radio podcast about worm composting and why every gardener should do it. And then the standard Gardening in Michigan website. And just a little quote to finish us off. To turn ordinary clothes into gardening clothes, simply mix with compost. And that's it for today. And I hope you guys all take the opportunity to compost in some way, shape, or form. Go as easy as you feel as you need to, but try it.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Learned a lot. I'm learning to appreciate worms a lot more, so that's good. Just a few reminders. Again, thank you to Kalamazoo Community Foundation for sponsoring this workshop. Next week, let's see what's on the schedule. We've got our ice cream social coming up next Wednesday. Hopefully we'll have some instructors and neighbors here, so feel free to rub some elbows and grab some ice cream cones with us. Otherwise, keep posted on our website for upcoming events and workshops. And thank you again.